Hello, my name is Kurt Kumlin. I'm a Senior Loss Control Consultant with Integrated Loss Control. And in this session we'll be talking about emergency action plans and fire prevention and protection plans. So our objective for this session is to discuss what is an emergency, remembering too that emergencies can take place at both home and at work. And then we'll talk about how to respond correctly and calmly in emergencies that do occur at work. You can find the Emergency Action Plan and the Fire Prevention Plan under the Health and Safety tab of the E-System, the Computer-Based Safety Program Management tool. From there you'll be taken to the Health and Safety module page here that looks like a filing cabinet. Here we would select from the Health and Safety Manual Compliance Programs. That would present us with this table of contents where we would select Emergency Action and Fire Prevention Plan. Emergencies are defined as urgent, unforeseen events which require immediate action. The most common types of emergencies we think of, particularly related to the workplace, are things like fire and explosion, a spill or release of a chemical, medical emergencies that can happen, and also weather and natural disasters. We don't often think of other types of emergencies that can occur, which includes violence and assaults, power outages, any acts of terrorism or acts of war, and bomb threats. When we think of emergency management, we want to think of it as being in phases. The first being the prevention phase. Here is where we look at our fire prevention systems that we have in place, the security measures in our facilities, and our safety programs or injury prevention programs. The next phase would be the planning, where we want to make sure we have the equipment that we need to respond to an emergency, that we train employees and practice the emergency response, like evacuation drills from a fire, and that we've established communications with any authorities that we would expect to respond to our emergencies. For example, a chemical spill, we may want to notify the fire department of any particular chemicals that are hazardous. And finally, the response phase, where we actually respond to the actual emergencies. This is where we're planning on our training and equipment and procedures to all fall into place for a proper response that minimizes injuries and loss. When discussing emergency communication, there's two types of communication to consider. One is the internal communication among our workers, which involves the supervisors, co-workers, notification systems internally, and that sort of thing. And then also the external types of communications that we want to consider, how we contact fire, police, and rescue units, and notify the public or notify the media of any emergencies that we have. And as a general rule of thumb, we want to accomplish the internal notification first, unless a situation warrants an immediate external notification, like a medical emergency that may require that we notify 911 before we notify other employees of the activities. There are several methods of reporting. One is verbal. For example, if we need to have a fire alarm, we can simply use an employee that will go around and notify employees of fire in the facility. If we're using our phone system, we want to make sure everyone understands the location and how to operate our phones. A location on how to operate a communication system if we have a PA system. And any other means that we may use for communication. Also how to dial for 911 in case we have a phone system that requires that we press the button 9 before we dial a 911 emergency number. Should a fire or explosion actually occur, there's a phase of discovery where we need to make a determination of whether we're going to try to extinguish the fire or evacuate the facility, our fight or flight mode. If we are looking at extinguishers, when a fire is in its incipient stage, we may remember that we need the proper class of fire extinguisher, Class A being for ordinary combustibles, Class B for liquid fires, Class C for electrical fires, and Class D for metal fires. If you're using the extinguisher, remember the acronym PASS, where we pull the pin, aim at the base of the fire, squeeze the handle, and sweep the extinguishing agent through the base of the fire. When we're operating the extinguisher, we make sure we stand several feet away and leave room for ourselves to escape. Remember that the extinguisher is only going to last for so long. It has a limited firing time. And a good basic rule of thumb, if it's going to take more than one extinguisher to extinguish a fire, we may want to evacuate rather than attempting to extinguish it. Other things to consider is how we're going to prevent the spread of fire by closing fire doors or making sure that our alarm systems are working. Where we're going to shut down equipment. How are we going to report the fire immediately? The evacuation, using the nearest safe route and helping others if it's safe to do so. Once we're evacuated, where are we going to gather? And then ensure that your escape is verified by someone and report anyone who's missing from our gathering point. Before the fire occurs, we want to make sure that we understand where our fire extinguishers are and how they operate and what class they are. So take time to find out where they're located in the work area. And remember the basics of using them, or the PASS acronym we mentioned before. Pulling the pin, aiming at the base of the fire, squeezing the handle, and sweeping the agent at the base of the fire. For evacuation, we want to make sure that we understand our evacuation routes. We want to find an evacuation route that's closest to the area where we're working in our facility. So no matter where you work, do you know where the emergency procedures are and how they apply to you? And if you're not sure, take time to ask questions about the program and find out. For medical emergencies, we want to make sure we know who the responders will be and how to contact them. We may have appointed individuals within the facility that we would expect to respond to first aid emergencies, or we would simply rely on emergency services that we would contact through 911. We want to make sure we know the locations of the phones so that we can make that notification right away. Find out where the eye wash stations are, so in an emergency, if you need to flush your eyes or take an employee to an eye wash for flushing their eyes, that you can get there in the quickest route possible. And locate the first aid kits. Consider making mental notes of your coworkers if you're aware of any medical conditions or medical history such as epilepsy or diabetes or heart condition. Maybe they have an EpiPen if they're subject to bee stings, that sort of thing. And if you have an opportunity, go ahead and take a community CPR class. They always come in handy, whether it's at work or off the job. For response in medical emergencies, the first thing we have to do is report it. If we're attending to an injured party, we want to send someone else to make that emergency notification so we can stay with the victim. And we should probably do is point a specific person to do that so we don't have people wondering who should go. If we're the ones calling 911 or whoever calls 911 needs to make sure that they stay on the line with those operators until they're told that they can hang up or until emergency services arrive. If the injury is related to chemicals, we want to find the safety data sheet or the container with the label on it. That'll provide the first aid response information we need for that particular chemical. If first aid is to be provided to the victim, we need to remember that's done on a voluntary basis so we can maintain our liability protection under Good Samaritan laws, which protect us when we do provide first aid to people on a voluntary basis. Remember, too, when we work with first aid cases that we have bloodborne pathogen exposures if there's blood involved. So make sure we're wearing our protective equipment like the gloves and the safety glasses. And finally, remember, don't move a victim unless it's absolutely necessary. We have emergency eye washes in our facility, and there's two types. One is attached to our first aid kit. This one is meant for temporary use to get us to other facilities where we can flush our eyes out for a longer period of time. This system is a system mounted to the wall that will last for the 15 minutes required to flush our eyes out adequately. We need to understand where these eye wash stations are located in our facility. They need to be inspected on a weekly basis to make sure they're close enough to the hazards that they're designed to protect us from. In the case of the green eye wash on the wall, we want to make sure that that flow of water is adequate to maintain the flow for 15 minutes. It's not a plumb system, but if we have one that's attached to the plumbing in the building, that needs to be flushed out on a periodic basis and make sure the controls work. If we need to use the eye wash, remember the few steps that we need to take. We need to remove any contaminated clothes, like a shirt that may have the chemicals on it. Need to flush our eyes for a period of 15 minutes until help arrives. And while we're doing that, make sure somebody goes to call for any emergency help that we might need. When you are flushing, make sure that you flush your eyes, face, ears, your hair. Make sure that you cover any areas in the shoulders that may be contaminated as well. Always help others as they use the eye washes, because their ability to see what they're doing is going to be limited. Severe weather is a common emergency in the workplace. With severe weather, we want to monitor the condition. This can be done through broadcast television or broadcast radio that transmits the weather alerts on a regular basis. We can use direct observation of the storm fronts as they approach our facilities, as long as we don't stay there too long or put ourselves in harm's way. We might want to keep a weather radio in the facility that is designed specifically for that purpose and to pick up notifications as they're transmitted. We also want to pay attention to warning sirens that may be set off by the city's emergency response departments. For severe weather, make sure that we've established a designated shelter within the facility where we can evacuate for protection if we were to experience a tornado or other high wind event in our facility. In a severe weather event such as a tornado, if we don't have a pre-established interior shelter, we can look at some other options like seeking the lowest level of the building. We might want to find a structurally small room that would provide the protection we would need. We want a room with no exterior walls or windows. And we can always look at getting under something heavy like a workbench or a desk, or we could seek some shelter in the doorframe of an interior doorway. After a severe weather event, we're going to be leaving the facilities. When we do, we need to make sure that we're aware of some hazards that will be out there. One of the most dangerous being high voltage power lines that have been down during the storm, either knocked over with trees or telephone poles, and that have blown against them, creating a hazard to those on the ground. If you encounter a down power line, and if you're in your car, make sure you stay there. You do not want to approach down power lines. If a power line falls down near you, get away from it using very small steps or bunny hopping. One of the emergencies we typically don't think of as an emergency in a workplace is occupational violence. This is the second most common cause of on-the-job fatalities, second only to motor vehicle accidents. As an organization, we need to plan for these events, beginning with preventing the violence from occurring in the first place. Some steps we can take include making sure that we report coworkers who are exhibiting violence or hostile behaviors, like making threats, maybe exhibiting physical or mental intimidation to other employees. They're talking about feelings of being singled out, persecuted, or being picked on. Maybe they speak of getting even with someone else in the workplace. If they seem to be preoccupied with violence or violent activities, or they are carrying or show off weapons that they may have. We want to report any physical conditions that create an opportunity for violence, such as poorly lit areas, defective locks on the doors, and perhaps somebody loitering around the facility that doesn't belong there. We also want to pay particular attention to conditions that compromise the barrier in the facility between the workplace and the general public. Things like broken or open doors or windows, maybe broken locks or unlocked doors that typically are locked at that time of day. Nearly all major violent events are preceded by minor incidents such as threats, pushing and shoving, or fistfights. Make sure that we report any hostile or violent encounters that we have with another employee or even a vendor or customer. And make sure that we're following our zero tolerance policy, primarily reporting any of these events that occur. If a major event should occur, like gunfire, we want to make sure that we evacuate the facility and proceed home. Make sure someone calls 911. If it's safe to do so, notify others in the building of the situation. You'll be contacted at home to ensure your escape. If it's impossible to evacuate, go to an isolated, normally unoccupied room with locking doors and limited visibility, and get under something heavy, like a heavy wooden or metal desk. If we receive a bomb threat, then we actually need to take some steps to try to identify where the bomb is located and the reasons that it's being used. If it's called in, we want to talk to the caller and ask them, where is the bomb? What does it look like? Why did you place the bomb? What kind of bomb is it? What time is it set to go off? What is your name? And who do you represent? While we're having this conversation, we want them to take notes, like the time of the call, the exact words that they use, any background noises that we might hear, the volume, tone, or speed of their speech, any accents or language that they may speak. whether it's male or female, whether their attitude's hostile, and if they use any peculiar expressions that might help identify who the person may be. Then we need to evacuate the facility, follow the procedure for fire evacuations, and go to that designated gathering point. If it's safe to do so, check the area for any unusual or suspicious packages or boxes before you leave. Also check while you're evacuating the facility. Pay attention to any other conditions that seem unusual, like doors that are usually closed or locked, or damaged windows or doors. Make sure that you report any of your findings once you've evacuated, but make sure you don't touch anything. There are some requirements for effective emergency action plans, one being the established evacuation routes and safe gathering areas. These should be published on a map and posted in common areas in the facilities for employees to look at. We need to have a system for accounting employees in those gathering areas once they do occur. We also need to make sure that we establish ahead of time any duties that anyone would have in an emergency, like dealing with a chemical spill, how to handle a fire when it occurs, if an explosion should occur, tornado shelters, those sorts of issues that need to be addressed. We need to make sure our emergency reporting procedures are in place. And we need to make sure that our alarm system is established, whether it's a verbal alarm system, a PA system, or an actual alarm system, and test it periodically to make sure that it's working. So in this program today, we've discussed details of our emergency action plan. We've talked about the duties of key persons and contacts within the facility. We've talked about preparing for a fire emergency. We've talked about establishing those emergency maps that identify our evacuation routes. And we talked about alarm systems. That ends the training program for this session. Thank you for completing the Emergency Action and Fire Prevention Training Program. If you have any questions, make sure that you ask a supervisor, or they can ask for assistance from Integrated Loss Control by contacting our office. Be safe.